Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iconic Comics review. And today we're taking a look at Black Ops Volume 6. This is the latest crossover in the Black Ops series. And one interesting thing about this franchise is that it has kind of become the Iconic Comics hub book. It's where guest characters seem to come and go, and different parts of the different franchises that Iconic owns or at least publishes um, have a chance to talk to each other, which is an interesting use for a book that kind of started as a gag about a somewhat intelligent rabbit. I'm going to get more into this when we discuss the analysis of this book and we talk some spoilers. But for now, I think it's an interesting choice for this franchise, which has always had, I think, a little bit of a limited potential based on the original premise. And so it's had to evolve in order to continue to present us with interesting stories to tell. We're going to review this, though, in the usual way. Even though Iconic Comics has a pretty solid standard for production values on its books, it's important to keep an eye on that to make sure they continue to maintain and maybe even improve that standard. And while this book doesn't really break any new ground, and I have the omnibus as well, but it's pretty much the same as this, just a thicker book, obviously. This book is, I mean, it's still a really good quality book. It's got that nice hard binding to it. It's got a stitched binding. This is not like a perfect binding with cardboard slapped around it. The pages are really nice. They have kind of a satiny finish. It's not high gloss, so it reads very well, even under direct light. And the pages themselves are nice, thick, good quality. Printing is great. No complaints there whatsoever. The story here is written by Mark Pellegrini, and it has art by both Timothy Lim and Matthew Weldon. Weldon, if you're not familiar with his work, if you've only read, for example, the Common Core series or the Black Ops series, is responsible for illustrating 2 of the 3 volumes of Soul Finder that Iconic has put out, and he also illustrates the Punchline series for Antarctic Press. And that's important in this book because this is the Iconic Antarctic crossover. So there's a lot of characters here from the Antarctic books. And I say a lot, I'm actually not that familiar with the Antarctic Press library. I know that they publish Common America, and I believe maybe Black Ops as well as floppies that get distributed in stores. But for the most part, they aren't deeply involved with the other titles that Iconic publishes, to my awareness. I'm not super familiar with the ins and outs of their publishing. But this is a crossover between some of their other books, which have had previous crossovers with at least Pellegrini and Lim's characters, and a decent part of the Iconic universe. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go here. In concept, this is a really neat idea. A lot of it is going to depend on execution, and all in all, I think the execution here is okay. Again, I'm going to be talking more about this when I get into the analysis. I have some thoughts about it on a couple of different fronts. But the addition of a second artist is really interesting because this is Weldon's art. It's very, very different from Timothy Lim's art, which you see more here on these pages. He is a much more detailed artist. I would have said up until this point, he's much less of a comedic artist, but he actually does a really great job adapting to the tone of the work he does. In both Soul Finder and Punchline, a couple of volumes of which I have reviewed on this channel, Weldon is working in a much more serious tone, whereas Common America and Black Ops are fairly slapstick. And I was surprised to see that very loose, gesture-driven art that Lim has in a lot of his action scenes, Weldon manages to replicate in his much more highly rendered style. It's a very impressive accomplishment. And I don't know if this is something Weldon has done before or if he just really stretched himself for this particular project, but what he accomplished is really, really neat. And I'm glad to see it there. So what one thing that was done here that makes this transition work is the story is roughly divided into three, really four segments, because there's an epilogue, a very short epilogue. And Weldon only handles one of those segments. So his art goes from beginning to end on a single story arc. And I think that does a pretty good job of making sure there's not a lot of dissonance in the artistic shift. That said, one of the things I really don't like about mainstream comic books is when a book changes from one creative team to another. Even just the artist changing, very jarring. It can make rereading a book less of an aesthetically appealing endeavor. I know that, as I mentioned before, Soulfinder transitioned from Timothy Lim on the first volume to Weldon on the second and third volume. So you can do it, and especially when stories change in tone, as Soulfinder did a little bit between that first volume and the following two, it can work. Having it change in the middle of a book like this is a little jarring. Not entirely to my taste, but it is very neat to see Weldon, drawing these new kinds of scenes. So 6 of one, half a dozen of another. And by the way, I really have only read the first 2 volumes of Punchline. He may have done some of this kind of work in later volumes of that series. I'm just not as familiar with it as I am his stuff that he's done with Iconic. I do intend to catch up on Punchline at some point. Just haven't had a chance so far. Let's talk a little bit about the story. The story here it's a crossover story, and that means that there has to be a reason for all these characters who normally don't interact to have a need to interact. And basically what it boils down to is Apex Moth, the leader of Cryptique, this cryptid focused group of outlaws, has put together a really major heist, and in response, the government has put together a task force of exceptional individuals to try and track him down. This runs the gamut from the Common Core to, of course, the Black Ops teams, Spec Ops and Black Ops, and then a number of people from the Antarctic Press lines, and, of course, Soulfinder 79, Father Redder from the Soulfinder series. So far, so good. Apparently the government is aware of all these people, much like you'd expect them to be, and it's going to throw them all at a bunch of different tasks. That's fine. The one thing that was a little bit weird about that, and I know this is a little bit comic book logic-y, but the act that Weldon illustrates takes place in Japan, where Sylvia Prestige and Kaneko, I believe is how you pronounce it, or Kaneko Kimiko of the Kaneko ramen brand. They are kind of the liaisons, and of course they're also part of the Common Core. It's a bit odd to have these 2 women who are high-profile celebrities and kind of business moguls show up in Japan with a U.S. Black Ops force and no apparent official sanction from the Japanese government. And I know that's a little bit realpolitik for a lighthearted comic book like this. I'm okay for the most part with letting it slide. Usually, Lim and Pellegrini are good with, kind of papering that over with just a line of dialogue or something like that. I would have liked to see it in that act of the story, but otherwise, it works pretty well. The thing that was most interesting here was that a lot of the action actually takes place in Long Harbor. I haven't read Alejandro Mirabel's Long Harbor. I know it is published by Iconic Comics, and it is basically about some fishermen at a fishing port where Cthulhian entities are kind of living in the bay, I believe is basically what's going on. There's a lot of body horror, a lot of very strange sea creatures, stranger than even the usual sea creatures. Because if you've seen some of the stuff that's in the oceans, yeah. All in all, that's an interesting premise. You take some characters like Father Redder, Harley, and Misha, you drop them into this very unsettling kind of body horror-esque, cosmic horror-esque part of the world, and you get to see them have some very interesting interactions. Okay, I haven't read Long Harbor, so I don't know, how close that hews to the usual ideas of cosmic horror. I do kind of tend to view cosmic horror as um I have a hard time taking it seriously because the core premise is an uncaring cosmos, and that just doesn't fit with the way I see the world. So when you have something that is just honestly, it strikes me as a bit of a childish idea. Um, Taken so seriously, I have a hard time with it, and it's particularly weird. Take Father Redder and drop him in there, but again, I'm not familiar with Mirabelle's take on it, and there is a justification in the iconic universe that kind of helps this add up and make sense. I'm going to talk more about that in the analysis section, so we'll set that aside. All in all, I think they did a pretty good job weaving all this stuff together. I very much felt like this story had a lot of, oh, hey, I know that person moments where I didn't know the person. In particular, Regina Rogowski, who is the protagonist of the Rags comic book series, and Tomorrow Girl, which I believe is another iconic comics, or not iconic comics, Antarctic comics superhero, have brief cameos. I don't know anything about the characters. I'm not sure if they were written in character or anything like that. They didn't do a whole lot for me to improve the story or help exposit on the central cast. And if you are going to have a cameo from another franchise show up, I think it would be better to really give them a chance to shine, to play into the main story a little bit stronger than either of those characters got. Even, to a certain extent, Versema was the same way. She's the heroine in Punchline, but, and this is important, Lynn Pellegrini had been setting up one of her villains as a player in Cryptique for some time. So I had been expecting her, even though I'm not deeply invested in that character. I don't follow that series as closely as I follow some of the other indie comic brands that I follow. I was still, expecting and invested in her showing up to a certain extent. So, obviously, in any crossover book, how important the character is to the story may not be as important as how invested you are in that character. And if you're not invested in a lot of the Anarchic titles, I don't know as this does a whole lot to push things forward for the universe as a whole. It does establish a couple of things. First of all, Apex Moth is clearly playing some kind of long game where he's acquiring bits and pieces of other cryptids. And what he seems to have actually been, well, we'll talk. Yeah. We're not quite ready for spoilers yet. So we'll set that off for the analysis in a second, too. All in all, I think this book does a really good job of giving you a taste of a bunch of different characters. The question is whether that is a good goal for a story to have. And I lean a little bit towards the no side. There's a lot of good things you can do with just presenting a smorgasbord of characters and letting people enjoy them. But I think that just a single volume, this is a 86 or 96 page book, 84, 96, something like that. I don't know if that's enough space to really accomplish what that kind of smorgasbord approach to character writing really wants to do. Probably it would have been better off cutting down on the character. It does progress the basic iconic universe forward another step. We see Apex Moth progressing his plan another step towards completion. We see some fallout from the end of Common America Volume 8. Harley and the Common Core are still dealing with the issues that came up there. All in all, it's interesting. I don't know if you need to read it in order to keep up with Common America, which is very obviously the mainline series. So I think your mileage is really seriously going to vary on this one. If you're looking to get into the Black Ops franchise, this is not the place to do it. I would pick up the Omnibus if you're really interested in it. Omnibus number 2, because I do think writing wise and storytelling wise, you're really seeing what the franchise is going to develop into in Omnibus number 2. If you don't want to spend on the Omnibus, you can pick up volume 4, which is the first volume in the Omnibus. And that will give you a taste, but I don't think it will give you full character arcs for anyone. All in all, I think Black Ops is a pretty neat series. I like the core idea. I think its focus might be spread a little bit too wide in this book. Everything is a little bit blurry, moves a little bit too fast to really get the entirety of that whimsy and fun that defines the heart of the book. That kind of disappoints me because Pazuki is now my favorite member of the Black Ops team. And while he wasn't introduced in here, this is his first full outing. And I would have liked to see a little bit more of him because he's very fun. He plays with the other central animal characters very well. He really contributes to that slapstick attitude that a lot of this has. But the second half of this book is almost entirely about the villains, the Common Core, and Father Redder, who are all great characters, but I don't know if they really want to be the centerpiece of a book like this. Kanina Hairtrigger is really the only Black Ops character with a major role in that part of the story. It's a part of, well, I guess Jackknife, the Jackalope there as well. He's pretty neat. But all in all, I kind of feel like the whimsical animal characters that are were originally at the heart of it are not so much at the heart of the story in this book. So there's definitely some sacrifices made for the big crossover that Lim and Pellegrini were going for. So it's an okay book. If you've been following the series already, pick it up. You'll enjoy it. But if you're looking for a introduction to the series, this is definitely not it. Let's talk story analysis. There are a couple of big problems with this book, and there are some very clever solutions to some of those problems. I already alluded to one when I talked about the weird intersection of a world where the Christian God is real and his priests have spiritual power to wage war on the forces of the fallen world, and the idea of cosmic horror, which is that we are in this uncaring universe and all the great intelligences don't even recognize that we are alive and meaningful people. This is solved by presenting the power behind Black Harbor as what appears to be Blackfire, one of the demons from the Soulfinder series, and in particular the one that we saw in Soulfinder Black Tide. That is a very interesting approach, showing these very Lovecraftian entities as just another deception of the enemy. And it makes a lot of sense for Lovecraft's mindset to be a evil shown particularly to him that he then spread to entrap people of a similar mindset. I like that solution. It's pretty good, and it does let you keep that sense of weirdness and wrongness and still put it in the cosmology you would expect of a universe that is fundamentally Christian, as the Soulfinder universe seems to be. Now, the other problem here, and admittedly this is a problem in a lot of books that have a kind of a superhero theme to them, power scaling. The character of Versema from Punchline is essentially Wonder Woman with a little bit of Supergirl thrown in. She's incredibly durable, incredibly strong. I don't remember if she has like traditional super speed where she can break the sound barrier or anything like that. But she seems to be powered down a decent amount. And it's been a while since I've read the Punchline books, so this may just be my memory playing tricks on me. But she seems a bit powered down for this book so that she doesn't just win the battle with Kreptique on her own. That's a bit of an issue. And like there's a point where she gets stabbed in the eye. She's fine because she has super durability. That seems, power scaling and super durability are tough things to deal with in any kind of superhero media because how do you know when they are going to get hurt? How do you know when they're not going to get hurt? It makes it very hard to gauge the risk level to characters in fights and whether they're going to come out on top or not. Um, all in all, I have to admit, when she showed up to fight in Japan, I felt very much like, oh, well, this is over now because she's going to win this. Her power level is so much higher than anyone in the Common Core or in Cryptique, or you know, Cryptique even had a new villain that they introduced here, and it wasn't quite a win button because, as I said before, Cryptique had one of her villains brought on board as well. So she had to deal with him. I think it was Jawbreaker. He's a shark, so it's a good name for a shark villain. All in all, though, like balancing those characters was a little bit tough. And again, when we got to Long Harbor, the character, I mean, Father Redder just seems to be really OP there. And I don't know if that's because like he's a soul finder or if he was just given sci-fi ordnance. He has a very sci-fi looking gun, that sequence. My impression of him in the Soul Finder series is that he's just a really, really fit guy who is proficient with weapons because he was, in the Army or maybe the Marines. I don't remember which off the top of my head. But he's ex-soldier, and so he's super fit. He has proficiency with weapons, but his real talent was his ability to wage spiritual warfare on the forces of hell. And, so he seems to have just gotten a buff. I don't know if Rogowski, she had this tactical onesie thing, which was a pretty good sight gag. But I don't know, that feels a little bit like playing with power levels just to make everything work as well. It was fairly noticeable, and especially for someone who's not familiar with it, if it feels like things are being scaled back or forth to me, I don't know, I would think I'm the target audience, trying to get me interested in some of these other characters. It didn't work out. So yeah, it's a tough thing to do in these kind of crossovers, and I think in the future it's best to try and keep it a little bit more narrow and refined. So you don't have to think as much about, does this work? Does this make sense? Is there any kind of internal logic to this? When it was just a Soul Finder crossover, it made a lot more sense because they were dealing with these kind of issues where you may need a combat exorcist. As the cast continues to expand, it gets a lot trickier. And I don't know as this was the best way to do it. It just didn't feel as immersive. I did not feel as much like I was reading a bunch of characters from a single world as much as I was reading a whole bunch of characters thrown together in a fan fiction. Maybe that's a little harsh, but honestly, I've felt that way about, a lot of the big crossover events in mainline comics as well. So, yeah, your mileage may vary. All in all, I think it's a good book, the franchise, because it does, again, progress Apex Moth's plans. It's very interesting to see some of his backstory, know that Blackfire may have been involved with him from the beginning, and to see that he's trying to get all these pieces of different cryptids potentially to biohack something of his own. That could be really neat as well. But the bulk of the story seems a little wobbly. I would like at some point to see a straight Black Ops book to get us back in touch with the main characters, and show us what Black Ops looks like now, when there aren't any other teams or any other franchises mixed in. Just my thoughts on the book. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.